Well, good evening, welcome. Um, I'm not going to introduce the guests today. You know who they are, Rukmini and Sharan. You know what they've done, the books they've written. That's why you're logged in any case. Um, I'll only say there is a sort of slightly bittersweet element to doing this today. I was supposed to do a session with Rukmini a couple of months back. That didn't happen for whatever reason. I was supposed to catch up with Sharan for a chat. That didn't happen. And then finally, the two stars align, and it so happens that that is the week where Amazon announces that it is shuttering Westland. Uh, and that news broke. I was checking out social media, and what I noticed was the flood of heartfelt tributes that poured in from readers, yeah, but also from authors, and some authors who were not even part of the Westland family. All of them had, great things to say about Westland, about the team and stuff. Uh, Rukmini and Sharan, the thing is, uh, I'm a non-author. I'm not plugged into the publishing world. I'm guessing that is true for most of the audience. So for us, publishers are these sort of nebulous, shadowy entities in the background. Um, I mean, we presume that they do a grammar check and decide on the font and the cover and send it to the press and from there to the publishers and stuff. Beyond that, you don't quite know what a good publisher brings to this relationship. I remember reading somebody saying that a good editor helps a writer and the book be the best it can be. I was wondering, since you guys are both Westland alumni, could you speak to that relationship? What exactly is it like working with a good publisher from ideation to execution? Rukmini, you want to go?
Sure, I'll go first, and then I'll be happy to hear from Sharon. Um, I'm sure my process was atypical, but it's been sort of joyous beginning to, and I'm not yet willing to say end because I remain hopeful. So let me just start by saying that, like everyone else here, like you, Prem, I was absolutely gutted by the news, and I remain hopeful that something can happen because Westland is important, and if there's anything that we've seen from all of the outpouring from people in the last few days, it's been that belief that I'm not alone in feeling that Westland is important. This is shared by so many people. I've joked with Kartika that my first meeting with her, I too am not plugged into publishing. This is my first book, and I don't have much to do with the publishing world. I'm a journalist, a sort of daily news reporter. And Kartika's, Westland is the only publishing house I've really interacted much with. And I've joked in my acknowledgements too that I can just assume that everyone in publishing is uniformly lovely and no mean words are ever exchanged, because that has been my experience at Westland. Katika was the first person I spoke to about the book, and I suppose what a great publisher can do is tell you that there is a book in you, because I didn't even know I had that. I knew I had this set of experiences. I didn't know what a book would look like, or that there even was a book in all of this. And I've joked with Kartika that my first meeting with her felt like the best first date ever, where you feel like you get each other perfectly. So that's what it was. So I suppose for me, it's entirely been my publisher has been the person who's told me that there is a book in it, and yes, this is what it could look like, and here's how we'll help you with it, and here it's out there, and here's how we're going to help it get to people. I really wish there were caveats or asterisks in this, but there simply aren't. They've been nanny, babysitter, Sherpa, guide, all of that all together. So yeah, I can't, I have no caveats to this at all, and this is what Westland has been, and I hugely appreciate their place in, the home they've given to my book, their place in the world of publishing, the way that bookstore owners eyes light up the minute a Westland representative walks into the store. They, actually like seeing old friends. So anyway, I don't want this to sound like a eulogy because I'm hopeful that it won't be. And I'd love to hear from Sharon.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to what Rukmini is saying. I had a great time with Westland. In fact, I worked with the same editorial team, Kartika and Ajita, when I published the previous book, which was a novel that was published by HarperCollins. And back then, the two of them were at Harper, and they kind of neatly moved on to Westland. And so it was really easy for me to kind of keep that relationship going. I want to just say that, lovely meeting Kartika, but I also had a great time working with Ajita for both books. She's a really good editor in the sense that she knows where you're coming from, and she also has a deep empathy for the material in a way that, I think, I presume is standard, but I have not worked with any other editor, so I don't really know. But, I think she has a lot of faith in my writing, which is really nice. But she also knows exactly, how to kind of tinker it and kind of make it better. In fact, the only time I kind of wrote to Ajita saying anything negative was that, can you do a little bit more editing on this because it doesn't seem to have the Ajita effect yet. So I really, our relationship was very much of equals in some sense, and I completely trusted her, which is really great. And the only other thing I want to say was, especially with this book, when I went to bookstores, like Rukmini is saying, with the sales folk, it was amazing. Like that's when you realize the other element of publishing, which is how these salespeople kind of go from bookstore to bookstore, representing your book and you and all the other books that your publisher brings out, and the kinds of relationships that they have. I actually wrote a Twitter thread on this, but just the fact that these people have been at it for 30 years, they know the ins and outs of the business, and they're willing to talk to everyone. A lot of sales is about just building relationships, and they do a great job. So that's basically been my additional experience in addition to what Rukmini has to say. I think that was my publishing experience too.
I think what jumped out at me from what both of you said is that I guess a good editor has a certain empathy, not just for the writer, but also for the material, the story the writer is trying to say, and that empathy helps bring out, the book the best it can be. A sort of related question is,
I'm going
I
to
don't know if
jump
I'm in,
I'm going to
yeah,
jump into something just to point out something, in the writing process. At one point, and this was this is Deepanjali Chadha, who at Westland, proofread the book. Um, at one point, when I was talking about women voters, I said something about, I was sort of trying to push back against the narrative that people who take money at the time of voting are
Hmm.
necessarily selling their votes, and that they might have multiple motivations. And I said something like, in in sophisticated terms you might call it something. And I remember Dipanjali and Kartika saying, does that sound condescending to suggest that then the decisions of the people you're talking about are not sophisticated, and that you are what you are talking about is sophisticated? And that's exactly it. To feel empathy about a person leaping out, who's just in black and white in front of you, and who, if you chose to, you could just be sort of blindly proofreading it and not looking at it with empathy. So yeah, that's, you feel deeply when you talk to people and then put them into your book, but to have them treated with that element of empathy and respect by even the person charged with fixing all of your apostrophe errors is really gratifying.
So wait, you went with academic parlance or something, right? Is that what you finally went with instead of sophisticated?
I use sophisticated, but I rephrase the sentence. You're freaking
I
me
see.
out, Sharan. You read too closely.
It's a very nice scene. But yeah, no,
yeah,
Prem, we
kind of
interrupted you.
a
So
no, no, no problem. Actually, this is meant to be a conversation. I'm not doing this I ask you answer kind of thing. There's no fun in that. A kind of related question is about, I don't know if I'm imagining it or whether it is actually borne out by the facts, but the last 2, 3 years, there seems to have been this efflorescence of nonfiction narrative. I mean, in the last 12 months or so, you can't travel much. You're stuck at home. And for me, stuck at home means basically reading. And I realized, well, as I was thinking about this call, that the books that I've read in this period, people like the two of you, obviously, but also Say, for instance, Suchitra Vijayan, Christoph Jaffrelot, M. Rajshekhar, Ashish Ketan, Aparna Karthikeyan, Kavita Rao, Josie Joseph, Akar Patel, Manu Pillai, um, Revati Lal, and this is a very inexhaustive list, but it looks like a roll of honor of nonfiction narratives, and there is this huge spread of themes, of subjects, of geographies, of insight. Um, I was wondering, is that a case of people stepping up to fill the gap that is being left by mainstream media, which seems to have sort of largely abdicated this thing of deep reporting, of nuance, um, of spending time with a subject and understanding it before you write about it? Is that just me, or is that what do you guys think?
Um, Rukmini, maybe you are the reporter, so, or the one with the journalistic background,
Sure.
so you should start.
I'll jump in a bit and then I'd
Yeah.
love to hear from you. So, I'm going to disagree with part of this, which is that I don't feel that the media has abdicated. I'm, a
Okay.
lifelong hard supporter of a lot of the media, a lot more than many would. And I feel like the biggest stories told in the last few years have come from the mainstream media. The nuances come from there too. Even if let's broaden the definition of mainstream media. Let's include, if we include Scroll in the mainstream media, and News Minute and Wire and the Caravan. So if we broaden the definition of the mainstream media, I do think exceptional reporting has come from here. But I think what happens is that sometimes, especially in daily news reporting, and I've always worked in daily newsrooms, the breadth of imagination has shrunk a bit. So I've definitely felt that in the writing of my book, that so much of what's gone in here as stories are things that I experienced on the road while writing for mainstream publications, but I never really had the vocabulary to figure out, or the imagination to figure out where to put it in. These weren't the stories that I was sent out to tell, but these were experiences, and they added up to my understanding of the country broadly, but I didn't know where to put them. So perhaps if we started equipping young journalists with just a bit more freedom to tell stories in multiple ways, and maybe to not feel that they're there to tell one story at all and that has to be told at one go. And I keep encouraging people to record everything in all sorts of media, not knowing what, not with a plan that I'm going there to do an audio story. You record some audio and then think later about what you're going to do about it. So yes, the depth of reporting in the books that you mentioned could not have been done in the media. They required book length treatments. The language of it, the grammar of it is completely different. But I would say that broadly, I feel that the big stories are being told, but that the leeway, the sort of string in the kite that you let loose to tell stories that you haven't necessarily that don't have to be told right there, that aren't quote unquote essential, that aren't part of the coverage plan for an election, or something like that. Those are things that we need to figure out how to do a better job of getting reporters to hang on to it, and then putting it together, maybe not necessarily in the book, maybe in the pages of the newspaper or magazine they're employed with, but in a more imaginative and unusual way.
I think the only thing I want to add here is if I could bring in the academics perspective a little bit. I think if you look at, say, economists writing previously, the EPW kind of housed fantastic writings from the 60s onwards of people like Krishna Raj and K.N. Raj and Amartya Sen. All these people wrote thick descriptions of the worlds that they were engaging with. In a way that I think that lost out for a bit in the middle. So the great debates on how the economy is going, for example, played out in the EPW. For even the poverty debates that Rukmini talks about extensively in her books. You had someone like an Angus Deaton, who was a Nobel Prize winning, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, right in the EPW about India's poverty numbers, and you had people like Himanshu and Abhijit Sen, and even Sujit Bhalla, I think, counter it in the EPW. So you had these like really great kind of writing that was about data, but was also about kind of human stories, kind of bringing that element into the data to some extent. Not all these debates did that, but many of them did that. That has kind of died down a bit, I think, recently. And so there's been a kind of space that's been vacated for people to kind of fill. And what my book, at least, or Rukmini's book, seems to do is to kind of try and get into that space a bit. We're not kind of publishing in these quote unquote academic social science journals, but we're kind of finding another avenue with our books. So that may also be another reason you're seeing some of this happen.
That's interesting, and I got properly schooled by Rukmini about the media abdicating part, which is kind of funny because I have always been a news person and never an author or whatever. But it kind of, I mean, the two of you have written books that, in some senses, are similar, but not. For example, Rukmini, your book focuses on data, and then from that derives insight, it derives um, knowledge, understanding, and you use human stories to sort of underline the data points you're making. And Sharan, despite the background as a researcher, Sharan's book is largely focused on the people and their struggle, and where he brings in data is when it's necessary to sort of further explain something that the people on the ground are going through. Um, I noticed on social media that both of you have been very bullish about the other's book. Rukmini's had a lot of nice things to say about Sharan's book and vice versa. Uh, I was wondering, could each of you talk about what you learned, what you took away from the other's book, please? Whoever wants to go first is.
Okay, I can go first here. I think the thing I really enjoyed about Rukmini's book was that many of these debates, so I had actually had access to. So, for example, the poverty debates I actually studied during my master's program in economics. What I found amazing was the astonishing clarity she brought to that debate by kind of taking these like extremely complex, definitions of uniform reference period and mixed reference period and all these like terminologies and words and kind of collapsing them into like a neat chapter that anybody can understand. That's a really hard craft. And the fact that Rukmini does it consistently and not just with poverty, with the GDP numbers, with the work, how India works chapter, all of these things I have also spent time thinking about. And yet, what kept striking me was here are things I know, and yet seeing them presented so cleanly makes my own understanding even better in some sense. So that's something I really like. The second thing I liked about the book was its excellent breadth. Like it just covers such a dizzying range of topics on India. I mean, it's the kind of thing that it's almost like an encyclopedia for today's India, with just looking at data in some sense and looking at the main issues. And that kind of breadth is really hard for a lot of academics like me. We kind of focus on one state, a few government programs, and we kind of go deep and kind of studies only some of that. But you need the kind of descriptive stylized facts about how the world looks to kind of then kind of go deeper. And Rukmini's ability to kind of first take the data, distill it into a clear set of facts about how the world looks, and she herself admits that the next step is why a lot of these things we're seeing are happening, and that's a harder thing to do. But even doing the how, which unfortunately, I mean, again, I don't want to sound like a cynic about academia, but unfortunately, a lot of us stop doing nice, thick descriptions, even with data, because at least in economics, there's not that much in mainstream economics that's often West focused. There's not that much reward for kind of writing these kind of descriptive facts about how the world looks, which Rukmini kind of nicely comes in and fills that gap for me. And then what it does is it kind of sparks a bunch of ideas in me. When I read the book, I'm like, this is something that I didn't know. Here's one random fact. I had read Somesh Jha's and the whole NSS 2017-18 report, that's now been junked. I had just forgotten that eating out was such a big element of urban consumption. It was just not a thing that registered, and yet Rukmini kind of picks that one thing out, and that immediately sparks a bunch of questions in me, which is why, who's eating out, where are they eating out, and there are things that you could kind of start thinking about along these lines. So that's basically what I really enjoyed about Rukmini's book.
Rukmini, your turn.
Thank you. That's super kind. And also, it's also interesting to hear this from your perspective, because most of the response, most of the people I've talked to are people who, for whom data is like the hard pill to swallow, and the stories is what sort of sweetened it. And if there were parts of the book that I worried most about, and thought people's eyes would glaze over most about, it would be things like the poverty debate. So at least some eyes in the broader Delhi institutional area did glaze over around those parts. Yes, you're right, Prem. I loved Sharan's book. In a lot of ways, it reminded me of. So it placed me in a bunch of places of thinking about difficult things, and in some ways it's my worst nightmare, in that it makes me think, it calls into question um, any great sort of dependence on official numbers immediately. If you're 10 pages into the book and you're going to start thinking, the next time that I look at administrative data from the NREG's MIS system, I'm going to think about all of the people who were not paid wages, and who, the villages in which the mukhia was adding days when it didn't exist, and the job cards, and all of these stories that the book goes into in so much detail. And obviously, as you understand quickly from going further into the book, you carry then this frame of thinking into all sorts of official data, as you should, right? That is something that I do make a plea for, but I do think I simultaneously depend quite heavily on official data, and I try not to depend on administrative data as much as possible. But yeah, that in some ways I feel like if people read your and my book together, or let's say if they read your book first and then read my book, they would be rolling their eyes a lot more at a lot more data sources, I think. So, no, so I do think that what it
Like,
does is it sort of points to, it lays out in great detail the the lies and half truths that can lie behind official data, and it sort of strengthens the case for greater investigation, whether journalistic or through people's movements, into official data. It also, in a very moving way, makes the case for what this data is for, and what it means to have, how data can be power. The very fact that there are people in the book who associate the computer or the internet with getting information about Nareka is moving, and then it's the sort of literal manifestation of information is power or data is power. um, Another thing that the book sort of got me thinking about again is that, um, it places me, and I know that this is something that Sharon sort of thinks about as well, which is, as a journalist, audit hearings, public hearings, investigations into the Narega, Jan Sunwais, these are things that a young reporter is frequently dispatched to. And many young reporters come into journalism from sort of left liberal backgrounds. Uh, and you're naturally drawn to these issues and sort of naturally empathetic to them, but it does also place you so close to these issues and subjects that it makes it hard for you to figure out where your place as a journalist lies. Should you be staying in MKS's provided accommodation while reporting on a Johnson ride? And as a journalist, you're sort of trained to think about conflicts of interest involving, say, going to car companies press conference and then them giving you some sort of handout. That's a clear conflict of interest. However, taking the help of a people's organization movement to go there and report on it, is not something that journalists typically think of, and it's obviously not the same thing. But the question of empathizing deeply with your subjects in a news organization, and then what it does for journalistic distance and objectivity, is something the book took me back to. Not because most of the issues in this are quite beyond debate, but some of these fit into a broader sort of bouquet of issues, which includes things around right to food, which have I would say, more nuance and more sides to it than Narega accountability, for example. Um, and yes, I do think that there is a sort of tension that happens there between very empathetic journalists reporting sort of very unidirectionally over time on these issues. So the book doesn't do this, but it did take me to that time, and to the questions that I grappled with, and I suppose I don't have full answers to either. But yes, enjoyed the book very much. I enjoyed how I enjoyed the insider outsider perspective that the book brought. Taking you right to the middle of village politics, of a wedding, of a Jansunwai, while reminding you, the reader, that the writer acknowledges his outsiderness. So that's something that again a nonfiction writer struggles with, and I think the fact that you do it so implicitly and so clearly is an interesting way to do it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was basically just me trying to save my back. If I say I'm an outsider up front, then people will be less, more forgiving of, what I say after that. But yeah, but
And
this,
you have a line early on where you say that you might as well have been from Kiribati. I can't remember the
yeah,
comparison.
yeah.
Somewhere.
Karnataka versus Kiribati.
Right. And it just reminded me that so often while reporting, people ask me if I'm a foreigner, not if I'm from somewhere else. So that's a good reminder of, you think that you're like your Hindi or whatever Gujarati that you're attempting is working, and then they ask you not just from where in the country you're from, but where in the world you're from. So that's how clearly an outsider you are then.
That's completely true.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how you guys look at each other's books. Just standing on the outside looking in, there's one other thing that struck me. Some books you read for the information. It sort of widens what you know of the world that you live in. Think of books like books based on history, for instance, like Manu Pillai's book. Uh, One thing I noticed in common for both you guys and your books, and particularly again in the last few days, something happens in the country, and I realize that I keep going back to these books to get a better understanding of why that is happening, to get a better sense of the zeitgeist that we're living in. Examples would be, for instance, the unemployment riots in UP and Bihar. And I promptly reached for Rukmini's book for the chapter on employment to see how that was playing out. And then again, I was looking at the budget coverage. I realized that Manrega had been cut,
Yeah.
among other things, health, employment, etc. But Manrega in particular, and immediately went back to some chapters of Sharan's book, uh, where to see, okay, this is how it was playing out on the ground. What is it going to be now that it is even less? Who gets affected? How do they get affected, etc. I think that's the best part of the books that you both have written, that it has a shelf life way beyond that one read. It's almost like a ready reference to what's happening in the world. I wanted to ask this. I'd imagine the hardest part of doing nonfiction narrative, the kind that you guys have been doing, would be that balance between subjectivity and objectivity, right? I mean, to make your narrative compelling, you need a high degree of empathy, which is a word that both of you have used several times in these few minutes. Uh, but that kind of empathy also carries its own inherent risk, in that you're so sort of invested in the lives that you're writing about. Um, but maybe even without knowing it, you tend to take sides. For instance, Sharan, you make no secret of the fact
Yeah.
that Sanjay Sani is a very good friend. That various of the people you've met and some of the organizations and all that you care deeply about. Uh, that kind of empathy, that kind of sense of belonging, not just as an outsider observing a subject, but being part of that story. What do you gain from that, from being that deeply embedded in people's lives, and what do you lose? And it
Um,
actually goes to both of you, because both of you report from the field.
Sharon, you should go first. Yeah.
okay. I think in terms of what you gain is you gain a deeper kind of understanding of the lives, in the sense that people are more willing to confide in you if they know that you are, you're genuine, you actually care about what they do, and you spend time with them, and so you get a lot more out of them in some sense. I think what you lose sometimes is a sense of broader perspective on, not everything these people do is always correct, and sometimes I see myself as being, I know that I am more subjectively kind of more aligned with them than maybe a more objective person could be. And this is true not just about me writing the book, but even amongst friends of the Muzaffarpur People's Movement, friends of Sanjay Sani. Some of us are more in support of many of the things they do, and others are more clear-eyed about their flaws, right? And in the book, I think partly because I wanted to kind of focus on the kind of almost miraculous nature of the movement, and not so much distract attention away from that. I didn't necessarily go into some of the elements that were more problematic. For example, I can talk about one here, which is that the Muzaffarpur People's Movement is basically 80% women or 90% women, right? So, and women kind of are the rank and file, they are at the forefront of dharnas, and they have increasingly come out of their homes and they have participated politically, not just in their villages, in the village meetings, but in the block, in the district level meetings and dharnas, which is all great. But the movement itself very much is still associated with Sanjay Sami. And this is true of many people's movements. If you think about MKSS, you will think about Haruna Roy and Nikhil Dey as the main people, even though there are many, many people who come from there, who are part of the movement, at least to the outside world, and often even within that context, the face of that movement will be one or two people, right? And this is kind of problematic if you're kind of also arguing for more voice, more space for the marginalized, more democratization of these processes. It is problematic that there's one person who kind of looms so much over any movement. So that's something that I think I don't spend that much time talking about in the book, but I am kind of more clear-eyed about it. But I felt, and again, here is the problem of empathy and kind of this one, I felt that I wanted to kind of get the reader to focus on all the things that these people have achieved without necessarily kind of presenting a fully objective version. So that's the trade-off that I kind of made. But I'm sure Rukmini also has thoughts about how to think about this.
Yeah, and my thoughts end up having to be, constrained by this very narrow objectivity trap that the media has got itself into now, right? Where this appearance of balance it's become comical, it's cartoonish now. And the writer Saman Subramanian, who's a friend to, in an interview, I think once said that objectivity is a sort of foolish pursuit because we are human, but what he seeks to be is fair. And I think that's a useful way to think about it. For me, the additional issue when it comes to data is sort of this trade-off in objective data and subjective stories. And I know that I'm not using people's stories or storytelling as a device. It's simply that I like talking to people and I enjoy sharing their stories. But there is a trade-off that happens because of what it means to pick out one story to tell when you're talking about a data set that covers 100,000 households. So what does it mean? What are the sort of ethical implications of picking? You're not saying that you're identifying the median household and representing all of the aspects of that data through that household. In fact, that's a sort of tired trope, honestly, to read when you're reading news reporting. So what does it mean to pick out someone who's, say, an outlier in it? Does it mean that then I'm invalidating what the data is saying? Does it make me less objective? And I know that in some cases in the book, I have ended up undermining my own point through stories, and I don't mind that because I do think reality is messy, and if the numbers look neat and stories mess that up, then that's good because that is how things probably are. So in one of the chapters which talks a lot about data on marriage, because that's what we have much more data on. Towards the end of it, I talked to a young man who says who is in an intercaste relationship himself, and when I said the numbers show that intercaste marriage in India is so rare. So, do you consider, what does it feel like? Do you feel lonely being, an outlier in this? And he said, well, that's because your data is on marriage, it's not on love. And he said, if you had data on intercaste relationships, people falling in love, it would be much more. He felt that the numbers would be much larger. He was seeing it in his friends around him, but he said they often didn't translate into marriage. Now, I don't know what the ethics or what the implications of putting that in are, because I don't have data on love. So am I saying that all of this data that I have constructed my chapter on, which is based around marriage, is then hollowed out by this, or is it are the points not valid anymore? Is it missing the real picture? So I don't have a good answer on how to mix storytelling with data, beyond the fact that I know that I don't like it becoming a formula.
Hmm.
I find it frustrating that the feedback from editors to data journalists always is find a way to humanize, start with a story, and that becomes a sort of trope that's very formulaic to read. I see it in a lot of news reporting, and it's a switch off for me. I can see that I can see the way the story is being constructed. In paragraph 1, I will start with the story. In paragraph 2, I will zoom out and show you how that person fits into the data set. It's tiresome to read it that way.
Yeah, I'm glad that you guys brought up some of these points, particularly that put a human face, which you hear a lot of in newsrooms. Also, equally glad that you brought up that whole distinction between being fair versus being objective. When people say they are objective or that they have no biases, I have this instinct to ask them to or to reach and check their pulse because they probably did. You can't be alive and unbiased. There's some bias or the other creeping in at some point. I, uh, while Rukmini was talking, our host Karnika Kohli of Scroll just put up a message saying we're over the 35-minute mark. And I found myself wishing that this was an Amit Verma conversation without a hard stop, probably 12 hours or whatever, because there's so much that there is to unpack, but it is what it is. So, call out to the readers if you have questions for Sharan and for Rukmini, please post it in the comments. And in about 5 minutes or so, we'll just get to that. Uh, like I said, there's a whole lot of things that I wanted to ask you guys about, but here's the one thing. Besides writing books, you guys have also tried to, I mean, in the writing, you've identified issues, problems. In Rukmani's case, problems with A, the collection of data, B, the availability or non availability of data, the incompleteness of it, all of that. And Sharon, you've, uh, through your work in the field, you found what can happen when data is complete and people can actually use it versus what happens when data is opaque and people don't have access to it. And both you guys, in your own ways, are working towards redressal as well, right? You're not just telling these stories. I know Sharon's working with a few state governments on this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Rukmini, you're trying to do the whole open source uh, data collection and stuff. Could you guys talk a little bit about that? I know that both of you are have been proselytizing the need for clear, transparent, easily available public information. Uh, Talk about that and talk about what you're doing.
Um, should I go first?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay. So I think there are two types of data that you can kind of make more transparent. The first is what Rukmini talks about extensively in her book, which is, the sample surveys, the NSS surveys and the labor force surveys. All of these things are kind of large sample surveys that actually give you a very nice snapshot picture of what's happening in the country, right? And the problem right now is that in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of these sample surveys are not being released. And with the census also now coming under threat because of the whole NRC debate, it's really, really scary to think about how we don't have these very big picture kind of snapshot stories, snapshot data surveys that could actually inform how we should think about it. Making this transparent doesn't necessarily always directly affect the person on the ground. But what it does is, if you're, say, someone, a parliamentarian or a legislator or a news reporter or an activist, all of you, or an academic activist like someone like John, all of you can use these kinds of data to kind of further, understand the country, but also make points that could further help policy that will help the last man on the ground. So that's a big picture That should be made transparent. I'm not doing much to kind of change that, but that's something that has to happen at a regular basis. The other kind of data, of course, is the data on the day-to-day, everyday functioning of the government. Right, there are a gazillion government schemes. Narega is one, but there are like 1,000 things. And a lot of these things, the government, especially in the last 10, 15 years, has built really good systems to actually collect the data. I am a little bit more bullish than Rukmini is in her book about the fact that internally these data sets are actually pretty good. They do a reasonable job of reflecting what's happening on the ground. It's only when there's a lot of scrutiny on these data sets and there's a lot of pressure to kind of make them public. For example, every village in Bihar is supposed to be open defecation free, and yet when I go and do field work at 4 a.m., I'm supposed to go and shit in the fields, right? So that's that contradiction you see every day, and Rukmini also talks about this, right? But internally, a lot of these government systems actually do a really good job of representing what's happening. They know the stories. They know that people are shitting out in the open because they collect this data, and there's a middle management that kind of makes sure that this data is at least available to them. I think what's happening is that there's a problem of making it transparent, and this is not a new problem. A lot of governments are very scared because they're scared that the opposition parties or journalists or anybody opposed to them will use this data against them, so they will not make it public. Now, not making it public basically means that we don't, anyone on the outside doesn't have a sense of what's going on. So how do we kind of slowly build mechanisms such that governments are forced to kind of make these things public without it completely upsetting the nature of government itself? I think that's the hardest kind of problem to solve. I am, the process of making things more transparent is kind of that advocacy we are all trying to do on the outside. From the inside, it's a slow process. But even just improving internally the data systems, that's what we're doing in Bihar and to a smaller extent in Karnataka also, because there are government schemes where data systems are not available real time. That you don't really know what's happening on a day-to-day basis. You don't have dashboards that help people who are above, slightly higher up in the hierarchy, to be able to analyze and read that data and then kind of make actions based on that data. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to work on. It's one step removed from making data public and putting data in the hands of the people, but it's still important because that is an important element of government functioning, because right now data has become really 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 important for the way governments function.
No, and that is
Look,
essential. And sorry,
no,
Prem.
I mean, I wanted you to talk about what you're doing, but I also wanted, while you're talking about it, um, I wanted you also to elaborate on a point that you make. In fact, there are some points that you make as bookends for the main uh, text of the book, both in the prologue and in the epilogue. And two things that jumped out at me. One is you caution against what you call a vague, overly broad skepticism and suspicion about official data. And you say that that can be as bad as, blindly believing what you see. And the other part of the thing is where you make the point that sometimes part of the problem is that, I think I'll quote, part of the problem is that statistics can be unintelligible, out of date, hard to find, and harder still to communicate. But the other part is that statistics alone don't tell us everything. They need context interpretation that's free from ideological spin and to be held up to the light. These are 2 points that you make at either end of your book. And through the work that you are doing, you and others are collectively doing to make data transparent, how do you address both of these things? The skepticism that you talk about and also the context.
Right. So, no, so that's a great point because, in a sense, having more open data does do both of those things, and I think this is something that I have come to quite late as well. In most of my early data journalism for news organizations, I had not thought through or been exposed to the concept of making our own data sets public. And I'm glad that that started later, and that's something we tried to do as much as we could at the Hindu. So, for example, when I did an analysis of sexual assault trials in Delhi's cases, I put the whole thing that I had coded into a spreadsheet and then made the spreadsheet available along with the story. Similarly, at one point, me and all of the Hindus reporters across the country did an analysis of family connections of incoming MPs into the 2014 16th Lok Sabha. we made that data set public as well. And I think we were just beginning at that point to learn and understand things like GitHub, which now are practices that organizations like the Hindu do quite a bit of, and I also encourage more people to do, because in one way it's important to me because it also helps build credibility to the reporting that you're doing. There's even if you try to do things that are relatively non-ideologically purely ideologically directed, there is a lot of questioning about whether you're cherry picking the data with good reason. There's plenty of biased media on all sides, and so having more of this data, I don't think purely open data on its own is a great storytelling tool, because I do think the average reader needs some direction and hand holding through that data, which I think is my job as a journalist. But for people who seek more data, or who want to do more work with it, or who want to fact check you, being able to put all of this out more and more in public is great. And I think this has been quite an important learning from all of our reporting over the last 6-8 months on excess mortality around COVID as well, because not just me, all of the other journalists who did this reporting put up our data on GitHub, and then subsequently it was organized by the development data lab people who also have made it all public. So it became then a large public data source, which then academics and other people have been able to build on. So you know I feel in some ways I don't want to be part of the problem that I see happening among a lot of younger people and younger journalists, where they are completely suspicious of all government data. So, can we trust government data? Is something I get asked a lot, and I think that's not a problem I want to be part of. Which is why I try to make sure that. Um, uh, questions or sort of suspicions are clearly directed with evidence behind it. There's no point being so again, the reporting around the GDP done by Pramit Bhattacharya and others at Mint is a good example of directed questioning, where the specific issues with the new GDP series were very clearly laid out, made absolutely clear. It wasn't sort of vague, finger pointing and suspicion around it. And I don't think it's sort of democratically helpful even to be overly broad, because in a sense it only strengthens the hand of the other side. If your suspicions are sort of overly broad, then you can be dismissed as just someone screaming in the wind. It's not helpful as a democratic tool at all. And yes, I mean, I do agree, and Sharon's book shows that as well, that statistics alone uh, is not going to if statistics alone were going to change minds, then everyone would have been convinced in 2014 that the Gujarat model had problems with it. That was not a story that data journalism, that was not a win for data journalism. So statistics alone, without context, without making it through, cutting through to a point that people want broader uptake around, is not going to work. And also part of the reason that statistics alone is not good enough is because the statistics themselves are not good enough. Now that I and maybe some other people know the problems with crime data, for example, what good is it to just ad nauseum go on repeating headline crime numbers as if they're cricket statistics? No offense, Prem. um,
The statistics are very reliable, by the way. They're very reliable. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, true. It's a bad example. As you can see, I know nothing about cricket statistics.
yeah.
Besides using them as a slur. So yes, what use are crime statistics on their own, without context and without being very clear of all that they're missing?
Yeah, it's a funny thing about having done cricket for about 5 years out of my 64 years existence. I can't seem to shake it. Uh, it keeps getting thrown in my face. But I was looking at the question side of this chat panel, and uh, Murli Neil has this point and a question attached to it. He says government has tons of data, but no incentive to share. Actually, there's an incentive on government to not share. We don't have health expenditure data for years now. The last is the 2017 estimates. And the question is, how can anyone make policy recommendations without data?
I
What
mean,
thoughts do you guys have on
yeah,
that?
it's really hard to make recommendations if you don't have some data. So data, I think, is an integral part of it. Of course, policy making is not just about data. It's a kind of a craft that involves kind of having some intuition, experience, theory, and then data. All four things, I think, are kind of important to kind of make policies, because data will never present the whole story, and there'll always be gaps, and you'll have to fill those gaps in one way or the other. But having no data basically means you can't even start thinking about good policy making. So I think that's the way I would think about it. In terms of governments having no incentive to share, we got really lucky with something like Narega, for example, where everything was supposed to be public and put in the law. So there was hardly any way that governments could weasel out of this, and there was enough political will right in the beginning that at least in the first few years a system was set up that we will record all of this and we will put everything out public, even if it takes a bit more time than it would be ideal. That's how Sanjay Sani found the whole corruption angle, right? So there are ways in which you could make governments incentivize you could incentivize governments to put out data and make the data public. I think the first step in some sense is to kind of just say make it public. There will be junk, but there should be ways kind of at least beginning to question that junk data that's being put out. So either social audits or grievance redressal mechanisms or any of these other things where you have or journalists doing a really good job of questioning that data. But we need that data to be put out. I think Rukmini's book also says that even with the larger sample surveys, you have to put the data out first before, and then you can kind of let people question it. You can kind of come back and defend and say, no, the data is fine. But at least let there be a debate. I think that's the first step, and that would be super important for policy. That's what I think.
No, and Sharon's point makes me think also about how we can think further about having more things put into the law, right? If that's what helped with the Nareka. Just for an example, this ridiculous sort of cat and mouse game that I've been playing with the National Health Mission's HMIS, again,
Right.
administrative data, where every time you use it to report up on it, it goes offline. So it just feels like that's actually what's happened 3 times now over the last 6 months. And I haven't actually figured out what the legal status of it is, but you do feel like if this was written into the NHM Act or something where you were obliged to have it online, then we do need to think more about having incentivizing it is one thing, and I do think that's important too. And I think more numerically literate media reporting would help. For example, not to go to town against Kerala for reporting higher numbers of fill in the blanks, right? It's going to report higher numbers of everything.
Right.
To train the media to not go to town every time it does that, and to sort of talk about the reporting effect would be one way to incentivize governments. But again, thinking about what more you can shove into acts would be a useful way to think about it too, I think.
I just want to say one quick thing. Often you'll be surprised by the fact that when we talk about governments, it is the middle bureaucracy that's the main problem in terms of making data transparent, because it's their jobs or whatever, their sense of professional security that's at stake. So often they are the ones who kind of resist giving you any data, giving you access to any data. Often you'll see politicians being somewhat sympathetic to making things more transparent, because I think they kind of have played this game long enough that one more journalist, one more researcher saying something, they can kind of take it, they can wear it on their chin. It's this infuriating middle bureaucracy that we run into all the time, and that's the one that I think we struggle with the most in terms of data transparency.
Yeah, I've just been warned that we have a gatekeeper, and she just warned
Yes.
me that we are pretty much coming to the end of time. But I had a quick question as we close down. What I noticed is that while the subjects that you guys have written about are very uh, dense within quotes, I guess, they're complicated. They're not, easy. Okay. Um, Whoever that is, I hope the person is safe.
Yes.
Right. Um, and yet the writing style is so incredibly accessible to laypersons. And Rukmini, I mean, honest confession, data makes my eyes glaze over, but I actually read your book start to finish without actually putting it down. Uh, so the question is, what are your writing influences? Where did you develop that voice from?
Rukmini, you should go because there's a siren behind me.
Oh, that's very easy. Okay. Um, hmm. I don't think my writing influences come from data, from people who work with data actually. So, I have, I mean, the writing that I admire is well told stories that don't necessarily have numbers in them. I think often about, I think of all the good things that have been said about Sainat's book over the years. One of the things that stays with me is the humor in it as well, right? Having that deft touch to truly dark stories is one of the things that his book did wonderfully. I think just the very power of I remember reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and realizing
Hmm.
the power of a deeply told story. And I think that's it felt like more powerful journalism than a lot of journalism I've read. I have said this before, but despite not being much of a Hindi person, I love Rag Darbari. It's again seems like the pinnacle of journalism in some ways, despite not being a journalistic story. I'm going to keep time in mind and stop with this.
Okay, so let me just say that Aman Sethi's A Free Man is one of my real favorites from the last decade. I think it's a fantastic, empathetic take on one person, but through that one person, you tell the story of the urban life of casual laborers in Delhi. So it's an incredible book, and it really stayed with me. I think beyond that, the book that I thought for me that really the style I wanted to emulate in some sense was Siddhartha Mukherjee's Gene. It was a complicated technical subject, and as a science writer, he tried to kind of humanize that subject by including stories about his own family. And yet, he also gave you the hard pill, which is to kind of learn about the biology and the chemistry of genes. I thought it was a phenomenal book. So these are the kinds of these are the two books that immediately kind of come to mind. I just recently finished reading Amartya Sen's Home in the World. I haven't read a more moving account of India of the 40s and the 50s in a while, and it's a book that tries to kind of tell you where his ideas that came later come from, where they kind of stem from. It's a wonderful take on a great life lived. So these are the books that immediately come to mind in terms of just what I've been reading.
Thank you, guys. I've just got a message saying that you need to wind up because they want to put this up without any crops. So thank you very much. And for the audience out there, if you haven't already, please buy Sharan's book on Bihar and Rukmini's book on understanding data, and a whole lot of other nonfiction books that have come out of the Westland stable, which could possibly, God knows what's going to happen to that after the end of the month. Thank you, Rukmini. Thank you, Sharan. This was brilliant. I just wish it was another couple of hours, but yeah, we'll
Thank
do
you
it
so
another
much,
time.
Prem. Thank you,
Thank
Rukmini.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.